Welcome everyone to Roundtable 1. We have, I think everybody's here. Amazing. I was just imagining if we were in a big conference center that we'd all be looking for rooms. So I guess this is the Zoom equivalent, but we're all here at 12 o'clock. Angela, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Alrighty, thank you. Welcome back to Reclaim Justice, a Restorative Justice Conference. I want to thank everyone who participated in the Circle's experience. And I was just tremendously blessed to be a part of my circle, and I hope you had an impactful time as well. We will now proceed with our roundtable discussion. We're going to honor the circular format used in Circle experience we just had, and panelists will speak and answer in a clockwise manner, allowing for a natural evolution of collectively facilitated conversation. There will be a question and answer portion, time permitting, for this first roundtable, but assuredly we will have time set aside after the second roundtable discussion. Give me one moment and I'll share our first circle. All right, so everyone should be able to see my screen. All right. Actually, I'll put that back up in a second. Let me first do bios. So for roundtable discussion 1, our topic is on restorative justice circles in our communities, family, schools, and workplace. Can restorative justice be the path forward to remembering who we truly are, both individually and collectively? Our first panelist is Brian Bourdier, Teen Restorative Justice Leader with Restorative Center. Next, we have Erica Davis from Brooklyn, New York, educator and administrator in New York City Public Schools. And let me go back to Brian. So Brian, for context, is from Bronx, New York. Maria Jane, Brooklyn, New York, advancing restorative justice. Jennifer Cameron, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, developing clemency and parole programming and legislative initiatives in Louisiana. Then we have Dean Barry Price, Bronx, New York, educator with New York City Public Schools. Deirdre Williams, Brooklyn, New York, Doctorate of Social Welfare and Restorative Justice educator. Anthony Posada, New York City, attorney and activist, son of a recently deported father. Anthony's activism on immigration rights in America is personal. Tamara Veal, Baton Rouge, Louisiana, advancing restorative justice in the Baton Rouge and SU Southern University Law Center community. Nirmala Nataraj, upstate New York, writer, editor, personal myth maker. Alisha Kohn, Newburgh, New York, formerly incarcerated transgender woman activist working towards prison abolition in Hudson Valley. And finally, Shailly Agnihotri, New York City and Louisiana, advocate for restorative justice and founder of the Restorative Center.
Thank you so much, Angela. I wanted you to take a minute to introduce yourself to the group too, if you could.
Yeah, no problem. I am a student here in New Orleans. Cardiovascular physiology is my work, but just as much of my work is community activism around gun violence prevention and environmental justice. And I'm honored to be the moderator today.
Thank you so much. You're doing a great job. Thank you. So this is, thank you. I don't think we need the seating chart. I think the panelists sort of know who goes before them and who goes after them at this point. So I'm going to begin the way we begin circles with a simple quote. It's in the beginning of our workbook, and I think it creates a nice framework for our discussion. Wisdom is like a baboa tree. No one individual can embrace it. So the first question I have for us is, what is justice? And I think this is a question I've asked in many different forums, and it's always interesting to see whatever individual analysis of this word is. And for me, I sort of see it as a vision of harmonics that can be accessed by people in harmony, so that when you have a discord, you can use the wisdom of the harmonics to recalibrate. That's one layer of justice. I'm going to pass it to Brian.
May you repeat the question again? My
What
bad.
is justice to you?
What is justice to me? Justice to me is getting to the root issue of the problem, not getting to the surface level of the problem, the person that, let's say committed the crime, but more like going further into there, seeing what societal factors caused them to commit the crime, and handling that along with getting that person the help they need. And once those two things are accomplished, and that's what I consider justice. And I'll pass on to Erica.
Justice to me is connected to the word peace, and I say peace and think not sort of surfacey peace, but sort of this place in oneself where there is a space of contentment. So what justice may be to me may be different to another person, but we each need to find our place of peace and contentment and sort of resolve with whatever may have happened. I pass to Maria.
I brought a quote from Bell Hooks, who asks, how do we hold people accountable for wrongdoing and at the same time remain in touch with their humanity enough to believe in their capacity to be transformed? I feel that this question and the answers that it calls forth is what connects us to what justice means. And it's in the seeking and creation of those answers that we travel the landscape and the horizon of justice. And I also think of how Bell Hooks' question calls on us to reflect on holding institutions accountable for not serving everyone equally, for perpetuating racial injustice. It's not that the system is broken, it is functioning exactly as it has been designed. And so we must ask after the capacity of these institutions to be transformed, and is it possible? And what paths, what ways do we need to build as we reclaim justice and humanity and dignity for everyone? I pass on to Jennifer.
I have a quote too, because I found it very hard to define justice for myself. So this is from Alexander Solzhenitsyn. I don't even know how to say his last name. I apologize. Justice is conscience, not a personal conscience, but the conscience of the whole of humanity. And I'm supposed to pass to Barry.
Barry, I don't know, is having trouble logging on, so we can go to Deidre.
Good morning, everybody. I've been thinking a lot about which quote to use. I was playing around with different quotes and for today, and one quote that's sticking to me right now is by Ruth Bader Ginsburg. My advice is fight for the things that you care about, but do it in a way that will lead others to join you. And I think a lot about that and the ways in which we show up in an equitable world, and what that could feel like and what that could look like. And I think I'm much like Erica. I don't think I have landed fully with a resolution of what justice formally means, but I have some ideas on what it could possibly mean for myself. And sitting and reimagining how we can be together in a space where we can have honest sharing of different narratives, the similarities and the differences, and being able to hold both. And what that could feel like would be a different sort of world rather than the opposition that exists. Anthony?
Thank you. For me, justice, I sort of think of gardening when I think of justice for some reason. When someone gardens, they have to care, they have to tend to, they have to protect, they have to support. Gardening is loving. It also gives you peace. To have full justice, we need to have love, and we need to have peace amongst each other. Justice that is devoid of peace or love is not justice. It is what the terms of that person is dictating for justice in that regard. If I seek justice in my community, is because I care for the people in my community, is because I care for my grandmother, for my aunt, and in turn they care for me and they protect me and nurture me. So we establish a justice amongst ourselves because we care and love each other and we have peace. In the greater society and the work, whether it's as a lawyer or whatever, the other versions of justice that occur don't allow for these spaces to happen where we can have these conversations of the heart. And so it's still not complete justice. And I pass it on to Tamara. Sorry if I mispronounced.
So I also brought a quote. It was by Benjamin Disraeli, and he said, "Justice is truth in action." And that quote really speaks to me because when I think of justice, I think of work. You're working to have an equitable future, be certain that the truth does come to light and everybody can live in it. But that's really, I see justice as a verb, if anything. It's something that you're working towards and ensuring that it is done, like Anthony said, with love and with a pure heart. And I'll pass it on to Nirmala. Did I say that correctly?
Thanks, Tamara. It's Nirmala, but thank you for asking. And I also brought a quote, and this is from Pema Chodron. It's important to remember when we're out there aggressively working for reform, that even if our particular issue doesn't get resolved, we are adding peace to the world. We have to do our best and at the same time give up all hope of fruition. So I scoured my archives for quotes on justice, and nothing really came close to kind of my vision of what justice is, but this came close to how I'm holding it today. And I guess that I look at justice as it's an act of integration, and it's very holistic. It's very inclusive. And in many ways, it defies our ideas of what should and should not happen. And it doesn't exclude the urgency of this current moment, but it goes way beyond this current moment. And I think it's an act of faith to operate with this understanding of justice, because justice is a long game. And we may not see results in the next few years or even our lifetimes, but we still have to show up and we still have to do this work and find our path along this arc of justice and understand that our cumulative actions really, they do matter. And I think it's very easy to see our actions as being insignificant in the larger scheme of things. And it's really important to hold the complexity of the relative truth and then the absolute. And I will pass it to Alisha.
So justice for me, not what it's portrayed in the society that we live in, is building community. It's self-love, it's self-accountability, it's self-awareness. It's loving the person next to you, loving the person down the street, loving the person in different parts of the world. It all comes down to building community with another and building love. Because if we all build community, we all build love, and we all strengthen our self-awareness and our self-care, then justice will be seen worldwide. And there will be no means for this carceral system. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Shailly.
Thank you. Those are all extremely beautiful thoughts. We could spend the next 2 hours just talking about that, but I'm going to keep us going and maybe we'll come back to these definitions. So I wanted to ask each one of you to share a story about an application of the restorative justice process, the TRC sort of, you guys have all been a part of in one way or the other, or just any other process if you wanted. To share a story about an experience that is resonating for you in reflection. And I'm going to start by talking about it was a revelatory moment for me because I was in the country of Jamaica studying their community-based model for restorative justice, where they had set up restorative justice centers in communities that were actually government funded by IMF funding. And I went to go see how this possibility of a parallel path towards unfoldment of conflict could be held without engaging the police state. So there were two tracks that were attempting to be formed. And then one of the visits was to the center near Bob Marley's hometown, which was really fun to see, and see his recording studio. But I digress. So a Rastafarian man came to speak with me about why he came to the Restorative Justice Center that the government had set up. And he spoke about the plight of the Rastafarians through oppression, through many different regimes. And I asked him why he came to this government center, to the Restorative Justice Center. And it was one of those conversations that really shifted my mind. And he said, I come to the Restorative Justice Center here because I am giving the government an opportunity to repair their relations with me. And I just thought, you know what, that just opened my mind, because I was so considering our own individual or communal relations that need repair, but the potential for using this process to actually repair our dysfunctional relationship with institutions and government was a profound gift I got from this conversation. So I'd like to pass it on to Brian.
An application of restorative justice, I have, ever since I've learned this model, I've actually incorporated it into just my daily life, to be honest, the core principles of it into my daily life, being able, the listening to others fully, good, and forming connections first before getting into the root of the problem. I've incorporated those factors into it, and like whenever I get into a slight argument with my family or with other people, instead of I try to use as much as the model I can in order to actually, get to the root of the problem, actually be able to do something about it and not just deal with the surface level tensions of it, because that's something that is important about the restorative justice model to me, that is that by the end of it, you usually get to the root of the problem, and you usually have talked about and come up with a solution to that problem, instead of just dealing with the surface level of it. So that is how I use it, and I'll just pass it on to Erica.
When I think about a story that comes to mind, so community came up in the last round, and when I think about a moment when there was restorative justice alive in my world, it had to do with community. It had to do with healing community, building community, and where that happened was in a school building. There's conflict often, and anytime we follow the channels of the formal channels of the system, we end up in a place of immense tension, and it lingers and it lasts for a really long time. And when we have spaces where we come together and people can actually talk and actually be heard, we begin to make progress. And I would say that in the last 6 months, there's been an immense need for healing, and being able to bring in circles into our community and having place for voice has been a really powerful place of healing. Not because we solved any problems, but because some of the solutions were people needing to be heard. And I've seen that with children, I've seen that with adults, I've seen that with all humans, that when we're heard, there is sort of this calmness that enters into the space. And so the power of putting people in a room and having a structure where there is everyone has an opportunity to share if they choose to share, or if they don't choose to share, they have that opportunity, has been extremely powerful. And I think about these times when there have been the absence of people and ways in which circles have brought people into the circle in their absence, and sometimes just by mentioning their voice, mentioning their name, has been a way to complete a space and to create wholeness when there are absent voices or absent individuals from our community. But the power of bringing the community together and allowing people's voices to rise to the surface has just been an amazing way in which I've seen restorative justice alive in my world. I pass it to Maria.
As I was thinking of this question of share a story of how I have applied restorative justice in my world, the feeling that came to me is actually restorative justice and the circle model that I have had the opportunity to experience and to learn about. It is shaping my world. It has become very instrumental to my perception of reality, to how I show up for myself and for others, and to my relatedness. I was born and I grew up, studied in Finland. I never came across something like circle work until, I want to say, year 2016 for the first time. That's when I encountered circle work, and it was in San Quentin prison in San Francisco, where I had the opportunity for a day to visit a year-long offender accountability program that is a year-long, essentially a circle process where the incarcerated people really do this work of listening and hearing and sharing stories, and in a very structured way. And for me, that was an experience where something told me, kind of this nudge, when we get those nudges, like pay attention to this. So circle work, since then, it's been with me. And we had the circle experience this morning, and once again, like, this is the space that we so lack. We don't have these spaces to come together with our pain and our fear and our grief. There are no spaces where we can do it in a trustworthy and reasonable way, and the circle is this space. And I feel that I have experienced myself as a more full human being in these circles. I've experienced deep discomfort, and also the feeling of being held in the integrity of the circle. And the circle ripples inward and it ripples outward, instead of being a straight line that just cuts across and we walk it alone. So restorative justice is applying into my world. It's shaping me. And since spring 2020, so since this spring, with the Restorative Center, I have also had the opportunity to learn and to participate as volunteer community anchor in a parole circle process with an individual who has served more than 2 decades for murder, and now is in a place where they want to make amends and to offer an authentic space for the family of their victim to be heard. And it's been a months-long process with this individual and their affinity group first for us to come together and build that community and to dialogue on our human experiences and to share in a deep way, and then also to address what happened more than 20 years ago. And as a community member in this process, my role has been, along with other community anchors, to listen and to look for humility, humanity, authenticity, compassion as we move forward. Surrendering all outcomes, but really just tuning into the shared wisdom. And in closing, I want to share, so as we have been documenting this process and reflecting after each circle, one of the questions has been, how would you describe this process to another person? And it really comes to me that this process reminds us that we belong to one another. And of course, it's complex. There are many levels to this and layers, legal considerations and everything. But in the end, it all boils down to we belong to one another. And trusting that process, what may emerge, what becomes possible when we pause and we listen and hear one another. And I want to quote a dear friend who also says that, may our shared wisdom and compassion enfold and unfold us, because it is already within us. We need that space for it to enfold us and unfold us. I will pass on to Jennifer.
So when I was thinking about this question, I really had to be honest with myself and acknowledge that my first encounter with restorative justice and the circle form was during our training this summer that we did after being a student in Shailly's class this summer and opting to move on to an externship this fall. Participating in that was really important to me because I wanted to know what I was entering into. And I have to say it shattered all of my preconceived notions. We did circles with people who I've never met face to face over a Zoom connection. And the thought that we could bridge that gap of all of our humanity and be able to share with each other over a computer, I was kind of skeptical. But the relationships and the connections that formed in those circles were just eye-opening and mind-blowing to me. Everyone shared in an authentic way. There was no apprehension, I guess, about sharing. I guess apprehension is the best word, because we were all in that safe space. That circle was held, every circle we did that week was held in a way that we all felt like we could share and be completely authentic. But the ultimate impact for me was at the end of the conference. And Shailly likes when we share this because it was just, we were trying to figure out a way to end the conference because it had been such a powerful training. And they decided to sing. And I don't sing. Y'all don't want to hear me sing. But everybody else sang. And when the song was being chosen, it was, I don't even have words for it, because the song that was chosen was a song that's very precious to me and my husband. My husband is incarcerated at Louisiana State Penitentiary. And when everybody sang, it was a song from when we were young, back when I had a huge crush on him and all of that good stuff. But I was literally in tears the entire time everybody sang, because it just, the fact that people I didn't even know had connected with me through this screen and this camera and were singing a song that meant so much to me personally, it was really hard to handle, actually. So I was bawling while everybody else was singing, but it just authenticated for me what the power of these circles can do, the relationships even over a computer. And it made me start, I had already had this idea in my mind about how we could use this for the parole and clemency processes, especially here in Louisiana, but it solidified the fact that we can reconnect with people. We can connect with people we don't know. We can reconnect with people who we've hurt. And the process of that and giving that chance to offenders and their victims is something that needs to be done. so that when people do get to come home, that they're coming home to a community that will embrace them and not ostracize them based on what they may have done 20, 25 years ago. So that's how it affected me. I'll pass to Deirdre.
Thank you, Jennifer. And what I had thought about when I originally heard this question was, I feel like your response took me in a different direction. And that's the power of circles, where we get to hear each other's responses and reflect on it and take some time to digest it. And as I'm digesting it, I think so much about community, and how I was raised was in a community. So I think I see every single circle, every single time I meet. I was not raised in this country. And by being raised in a different country, there's different ideas, and there's different expectations of how to show up in the world. And the way that I was taught to show up was to be community oriented, to look out for the next person, and to, support one another. And in moving officially to America and being here for, a lot of time, I've realized, a lot of times family kind of jokes and they're like, you're the Americanized one, right? Because the ideas that I hold in conversation is more individualistic. But I still have those remnants of how I was raised and what's important to me in being in a collective and being in a community. And I think that that's what actually led me here to understanding more about what restorative justice looks like, because I knew there's another way. I always, in my spirit, knew there was another way to the judicial system that we're using right now. I've always worked with court-involved youth, whether in therapeutic settings, in their home, or in a clinic, or in a legal setting. And no matter where I went, there were some themes that were prevalent. There's a disproportionate minority representation. There's disparate treatment. And that always led me to trying to figure out, well, what can be the solution? What can be something that can help to support what I believe in, and to bring back the community into the work that we're doing? Because I would often have conversations with a lot of parents who felt like they had no other resources except to call the police on their child, and that was their last resort. But there was nothing else for them. At least they felt that way. So my digging and my searching, and I didn't realize that I was digging and searching for a restorative justice model. I knew there was something else, and I was digging and searching for that, and stumbled upon a wonderful training over the weekend with the TRC, with the Restorative Center in 2016, and it just jived with my spirit, and I never looked back. And I continue to incorporate that in my work, not only with the center, but I also incorporate it with, like, when we do trainings, I think a lot about my philosophy and how my philosophy aligns with TRC. But also, I had the pleasure of defending my capstone project in July, and it's the equivalent of a dissertation. And one of the papers that I wrote was really difficult for me, because that was where my heartbreak was. And I had a really tough time writing about it, because it was exactly about the population I work with, disparate treatment of Black and Brown youth throughout this country, the disproportionate minority representation within court systems. And I kind of just wanted to, like, have my paper be like scolding people to be better, to act better. And when I had a conversation with my my committee, they had reminded me that I had already had some experience with restorative justice practices and models, and that was TRC. And how do I incorporate that with another framework to try to incorporate that in what I wanted to bring to the world? Because a phrase that my chairperson mentioned was, you can't just lead people into the darkness, you have to bring them to the light. And so I thought a lot about what brought me to the light and what brought me back into, okay, I don't have to feel as jaded, that this is not a end all be all, that the system's not going to remain this way forever, that there's some solutions that we can kind of hold and to be able to move forward with that. And I thought about the principles of TRC and how they resonate so much with who I am and how I believe that I can show up in the world and how other people can show up in the world, and started to incorporate that some more. And that was really impactful. And it's really impacted my writing. It's impacted the way that I show up in different spaces. Yeah. Anthony.
Thank you, Deidre. For me, holding the restorative justice as applied really comes down to thinking of like a spider web. So I know that my bio touches on like my father's deportation, but like he didn't just get on a plane to deport himself. It was a product of mass incarceration, of 25 years of being incarcerated, and then many other family members being incarcerated. But basically, it's not a story that is uncommon. Like many Latino families, my grandmother and my aunts had multiple jobs to hold down the home. My father had several of us, so it wasn't just myself. And so those are mouths that have to be fed. So you just add the layers on top of it. But I didn't have anybody to navigate that with or to sort of process that outside of just the family space. But what was very clear was that the system was on a very clear path for the destruction of my family. And by the extension of that, the destruction of my community. Whether in the form of our annihilation, of making us feel invisible, or putting over us this illusion that we're separated. In doing the work as a public defender, it was very clear, and I didn't come into public defense work thinking that it was the end all be all. I know the limitations of the system. I mean, I lived for it. I lived it in my own bones. Because when a family member does time, the whole family does time with that person as well. It isn't just that person. So I didn't have any of these illusions about what the system could accomplish, but it was thankfully in a training that I met Shailly and some great people and was blessed to experience what restorative justice and holding a space meant. And I come back to the spider web. It's holding space to me, which is always what resonates the most of this exercise, because we can call ourselves circle keepers. We can, again, right, keeping the agenda at the door. It's not about us. It's holding space. And most recently, during the George Floyd protest and the more protests here, and on one end, sort of helping people who were being brutalized, who were peacefully protesting in my job. And then on the other end, working with not-for-profit organizations who wanted to process a lot of that trauma that was not being talked about within their own organizations, of the racism that was being harbored there, that was not being acknowledged, and just to process emotions. So I saw the experience there, and then took it a step further with the Latino community here. For community members who lost so many loved ones to COVID, so many of them did not know how to file certificates for benefits for funeral services or cremations. And again, holding the space for us, for all of that to be processed, and so that we can move on together as one, as a community. So the examples can go on, and I'm, as they say in some worlds, I drank all the Kool-Aid and then some. But for me, I've seen youth being changed by this. I've seen people, whatever, just human beings, whether they want to call them formally incarcerated or justice involved, just people touched because they were acknowledged and listened to, because there was space created for them. So I now pass it on to Tamara.
Okay. So similar to Jen, my first experience with restorative justice was with TRC this past summer with their week-long seminar for training to become a circle keeper. And, you know, I instantly thought of the end of the week where we had, we were all singing together. Well, the song was Somebody to Lean On. And Jen, while you were talking about it, I kind of teared up a little bit because it was an emotional time. But I think about that past week, and I think how great it was to connect with people on a human level, a very basic level, to see people for their experiences and who they are as a person. I believe sometimes when we meet people, there's almost like a barrier. We kind of see them as, for example, you know, Deirdre, you might be Dr. Williams when I first meet you, but in that circle, it was so nice to meet you as Deirdre and meet you as, I remember you had shared a story about you would eat homemade ice cream with, I think, your grandparents. And it was something that, you know, I was able to really connect with you on, again, such a personal and basic level. And that was something that I thought was so beautiful with this circle process and something that needed to expand to everybody. You know, I wouldn't say that this one thing is going to save the world, but I definitely think it is a major step in making a more equitable and peaceful world for all of us to live in. But it was really that week-long seminar was very beautiful, very heart-touching, very heartwarming to connect with so many people, again, you know, just through a Zoom screen. And I've met one woman, I would say we're almost best friends now. Someone I probably before that moment in time couldn't point out on the side of the sidewalk, but now I call her up and we talk about everything under the sun, you know, hard topics, difficult topics, you know, current events, what's going on, things that you probably wouldn't normally be able to talk about with someone you met for maybe 1 or 2 times, but I met her for 5 days and she's someone I could put on my speed dial. And I just thank TRC for allowing that process and making that space safe for everyone involved to be able to connect with one another. And so I'll pass it on to Nirmala. Did I say it right?
Yeah. Thanks, Tamara. So like a lot of people here, my approach to restorative justice has really been informed by TRC and the circle process. But just to give you a little bit more background on me, I'm a book editor, a writer, and I also work with organizations and individuals to help them decolonize their language so they can tell better stories. So I would say that all of this work, everything I do, everything that I'm passionate about is connected to this deep belief in the power of stories to transform our lives and the worlds that we live in. And my focus with the work of restorative justice is something that I like to call restorying. So this is storytelling as an intentional practice of collective meaning making and what I call myth making. And when I say myth making, I'm not referring to myths as in lies, but myths that are the truths that exist beyond the literal dimension, you know, the truths that live in our sacred stories and in our hearts. And the stories of people who have historically lived at the margins, those are the stories that have interested me the most, because these are the people who are not being served by the collective narrative that we've either agreed to or that we've been dragged into. But a lot of my work with restorative justice actually began in theater and with a format called playback theater, which is basically community participatory theater. And in this format, you have people in an audience who are telling their stories from their lives, and then they're watching them enacted on the spot by an ensemble of actors. And I think there's something about approaching justice, which can sometimes feel so abstract and scary to a lot of people, by approaching justice through the lens of storytelling. This is very different from, let's say, approaching justice as a form of conflict transformation or just any straightforward restorative justice process. So it's theater, which means that it's play, it's people and their stories, and there's room for magic in that. And it's not weighted down by a lot of these concepts that can feel so heavy for people. And that includes justice, and it includes looking at conflict and the hard conversations. But, you know, at the same time, theater still involves a very emotional, cathartic, and sometimes heavy process. So one of the experiences that comes to mind for me was when I was doing playback theater when I lived in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I was volunteering at a shelter for people who were survivors of domestic violence. And the majority of these were immigrant women of color, for whom English was not a first language. So the work that I was doing with my playback troupe was we created a performance where the people in this shelter got to tell their stories and they got to see them reenacted. And what was really interesting is that we were holding a space for the stories that wanted to emerge. We didn't go into it with any preconceived notions about what those stories would be. And what was really surprising was that the stories that were being shared in that space were not necessarily stories of brutality that they'd faced, but a lot of these were stories about their hopes and dreams for their futures and for their children, and stories about intergenerational wisdom and resilience. So it was really the focus of this whole experience is it wasn't that they were vilifying or even forgiving the people who'd been perpetrators of violence. It was really literally an experience of them being able to make more space for the stories that were maybe lurking on the margins, but that hadn't been given the opportunity to be expressed. And as it turned out, the main story that was kind of the thread throughout all of these stories that we were enacting, it was not about hopelessness or fear or trauma or the pain of being victimized. It was actually about the right and the willingness to reclaim joy, to reclaim dignity and self-worth, and to also just know that we're not alone in that struggle. So being a part of that process was life-changing for me, because it really made me realize that something that took place in the past, it still lives on as a story in the body, but we don't always know what these stories are. And playback theater has the potential to bring that story out into the forefront, and also just to introduce some possibilities about how we can change the narrative. So we're not just literally retelling the things that happened to us, but we might be adding insights that shift our perspective or that help us to see ourselves and our lives in a totally different light. And, you know, sometimes people ask me, well, is playback theater really a restorative process? Because if the perpetrators were not present, does that still make it a restorative process? And I would say that in this example, that was a beginning. And I have also done playback theater with communities of people who were in conflict with each other, but I see the same dynamics at play. So I often reflect on the fact that when we think about restorative justice, sometimes there's a tendency to conflate that with forgiveness or resolving the conflicts that we've experienced. And I think that from my work with theater, that can be a possibility down the line, but it's not actually the main purpose of why we are getting together and doing this work. It's really about making space for the stories that want to emerge. And almost always, even in places where there's extreme suffering, I have discovered that a lot of the stories that want to emerge are stories about our shared humanity. And they can be funny, they can be outrageous, they can be tragic, they can be just about anything that you might think of. But part of the art of playback theater is about leaving room for the unexpected. And what I've discovered is that when people are able to see and know their stories without forcing any sort of outcome, the unexpected happens, and there's potential for deep transformation in that. So in many ways, when I think of restorative justice work, I really like to think of it as transformative, because we don't start at the outset with this idea of what is supposed to happen. For me, it's about letting the stories emerge and trusting that process, which is also something that has really deepened for me in my own work with TRC. And I will pass it to Alisha.
Thank you. So when I think about restorative justice, I like to say like I'm an old new, you know, when it comes to like the restorative process. So my first introduction to like the formal circle keeper and with the Restorative Center was over the summer. And I was privileged enough to actually go to a physical retreat in middle of COVID. And it was amazing because after a summer long of protest, after inside quarantined, you know, everything that was happening, to at the end of the summer to come into be trained as a circle keeper in person, it was amazing. And to build that community and meeting wonderful people. And I mean, I can go on and on about like little things that were just amazing about the process aside from the training, but like being in community with a bunch of people who you don't know, like that was very impactful to me. And yeah, but it also gave me a definition. It gave me a definition of what restorative justice is. So during my time of incarceration, I was using restorative justice practices in my community inside the prison. We were using restorative practices. We were holding each other accountable for certain things. We were working together to solve an issue. If there was an issue within the cell block, individuals at the community, and it doesn't matter where you landed in this hierarchy of this, you know, prison system, you work together and you hold each other accountable to build this community, because we recognize that when something happens, that we all lose these privileges, right? We lose these privileges such as getting some, you know, some sun, some fresh air. We lose privileges like taking a shower. We lose privileges like using the phone. We lose privileges like eating a meal if something happens in the cell block. And so we would hold each other accountable. And if a person was not acting according and would put the whole entire block in jeopardy, we would take care of it ourselves without the police, without the cops, without the correctional officers, without any of that. And what was amazing to me, it was just like, I didn't recognize that what was going on until I attended this training over the summer, and I was given like an actual definite, I was like, oh, so this is what happens, right? This is what happens in a very formal setting of what a restorative circle can be, what a circle keeper can be like. And it was amazing. It was amazing in a sense of like, now that I have plans for the future, it's amazing how I'm using the restorative process and the circle keeper process within my own organizing, within my own community, building relationships with my friends, the people I work with, and just coming back into whole and to working together, because something's got to change. And prison's not the answer. The carceral system's not the answer. And so as, you know, someone who's formerly incarcerated, it's like, I feel privileged to like just be on this panel and to understand like, hey, like there's like language for what's going on. Like there's a language for what it is. And none of us were circle keepers. We just cared about us and us as a whole, to realize that we just need to move forward, and we need to like make sure like, okay, don't smoke on the cell block when that certain officer was there. Okay, don't mess up and get drugs, right? And, you know, don't overdose. Like, I mean, when it comes to the prison system, like we literally dealt with everything from rape to physical violence, to overdoses, to robberies, everything like that. We did it. And because we understood that we had to look out for each other, and it doesn't matter where we fall into. It doesn't matter if you were on the top rung or you're on the bottom rung. And that's like how I look at like restorative, is looking out for each other and not involving police. And that's what's really been impactful about understanding what the restorative circle can be, is like I was saying in my first response, is like, it's building community. If we can build community and we can know that we're all tied in this together, then we can move forward. And with that, I'm going to pass it to Shailly.
Thank you. Hey, Barry, are you able to join us now? Because I think Barry was having trouble logging on, and I sort of got word that he's now here. Hey, Barry, welcome to the panel. I'm glad you made it.
Thank you.
So we've already sort of gone around twice, but I was wondering if you could do maybe you and I could just talk really, briefly so that you could be part of this discussion now about how you came to sort of implement within your school our model of restorative justice, and why you came to it from a different point of view. And sort of you had the zero policy school, and then, if you could just talk a little bit about that, that would be a great way for you to just join the conversation.
Absolutely. First off, let me say hi to Brian, one of our ex-students. What's up, Brian?
Well, let's not call him an ex-student, it's superstar graduates.
Well, I'm a high school dean. I was a math teacher for 10 years in the South Bronx, middle school and high school. And then my boss promoted me to a dean, and it was zero tolerance. And I started reading about restorative justice before it became known to New York City. But in New York City, they made a change in the document, like the discipline code book. They just said everybody's going to do restorative justice without any training. It was just written. They had no idea. I found this conference. I forgot where, and I think it was somewhere in Pennsylvania. And I was to turn around and implement restorative justice in our school. And then I had no training. And in that training where I went to, it was very interesting because it was all administrators, social workers, lawyers. I was pretty much the only educator. And they were doing circles, and I didn't know what a circle was. And they kept talking about it until I went to Shailly's meeting. It was the only one that did circles. So for the first time, I kept hearing about, all right, you just got to go back, you got to do circles. All right, great, what is it? But I sat in hers, and obviously, like you guys all know, the light bulb clicked. And I talked to Shailly after, and she was unbelievably humble and offered her help. So when we came back, I can share about her coming into our school, but my journey was very interesting. It's really a mindset. As it went from just a kid doing something wrong, or a student, and then looking up the discipline code book and handing out like tickets like a police officer, to just asking a simple question, what happened? That, I know that may not seem like much, but it's the evolution. It's the starting of being at the beginning of the mountain. And when I can get teachers on board to just ask what happened, it starts the healing process, because it validates the other student's point of view, and you can hear them, and you're validating what happened, and you're willing to listen versus you cursed me out. Because you cursed me out, this is the punishment. So bringing that back and then when we did circles in our school, the teachers were obviously very fearful of losing control. But when they watched us model it, they were blown away. The students were much easier. They were so much more intellectual, so much more open than the teachers were. The students were the easy part. It was getting the teachers on board with restorative justice. The students, as Brian's a testimony, they got on right away, and they were, you can just see the iceberg, the things that were underneath, all the hurts and the pains that came out because of what Shailly and like what we've brought to the table, just creating that environment. I think somebody else said it before, that we were all equal. I wasn't a high school dean. I was just another person in that room. And that's so profound when the students realize how safe it was to be able to just talk. And they started asking for it. They would go, Mr. Price, when are we going to do another circle? When are we going to do another circle? And the students were hungry to hear their voices. And the teachers who slowly came on board, because they were like, wow, this person who they thought was so-called the troublemaker were the leaders in the room after their voices were heard, and they realized the lacking skill that student had. They weren't outbursts because of no reason. There was something in there. And once the teacher could see that, transformation happened. It was just phenomenal. I don't know, Shailly, I don't know if I hit all the key points, but that was a quick
Thank you, Barry.
snippet.
And Barry, did you have a definition of justice that you wanted to share with us? Because we did that round one.
It's very interesting. I guess it really depends to me on the situation, but what I don't like about it, I can only speak from an educator point of view. Teachers will sometimes use like the grade book as justice. Well, this kid didn't do this, well, I'll punish him with a grade. You know, so it's, to me, it's just meeting this. Brian, you can understand that, right? It's meeting them where they're at, and it's I guess it's. I guess I look at it like a seesaw, if that makes any sense. It is a seesaw, and justice can be like that way. It doesn't have to be, you know, just because you did this, I'm going to do this. So if I'm an adult and a student does this, there's a gap, and I have to meet them. So justice is this, to me, it's meeting somebody where they're at and looking for solutions, not looking to be punitive. And I was as guilty of it as anybody when I was first starting off as a high school dean. I mean, I don't think Brian was there when I just started, because my first year I was horrible. My teachers thought I was amazing because I was handing out suspensions left and right, but I was really a horrible dean because I was Mr. Punitive. I didn't listen to somebody's point of view. You did this, I'm going to do that. So I was transformed in the process, and I learned more from the students than I ever taught them. Okay.
Thank you, Barry. So we're going to leave you right in this spot in the circle. So after you, I'll go, and Alisha will just send to you next time around. That's good for everybody. Yeah. So I guess what I'd like to do now that we've sort of gotten an overview of sort of the concepts of justice that we're dealing with and the concepts of restorative justice, I know each one of you has had like really specific work in the field. There are a lot of people that have joined us from around the country, which was really fun to see the registrations, but people also are looking for real specific information on, you know, talking your thesis, like the meat of the work. So I'm going to start with the Circle Keeper Code, because for me, that's the meat of the work that I've done, right? Which is to create a model for restorative justice that is replicable, that's teachable, but that does require the Circle Keeper to be part of the community that is being formed in the circle. And that requires training and also many different things, but I'll just read the code because it sort of summarizes the core teachings of our very specific, unique model of restorative justice. I'm sorry, if I can find it, I will definitely do it faster. Okay, the Circle Keeper Code for TRC. All are welcome, none may sabotage. We are caretakers of a sacred space. We are experts in form, not substance. We check our agenda at the door. We are energy workers. We do the work and surrender the results. We model authentic presence and easeful listening. We do our shadow work, identify, examine, reclaim, and release. We hold space with humility. We have compassion for ourselves and others. We seek to be the change we wish to see. And I think that the part of this that has been often the focus of our trainings, there's been a couple, the shadow work and also leaving our agenda at the door, because in the way that we imagine an effective circle process in line with the vision we have for restorative justice and justice, we imagine that the circle keepers do not become the mini judges we're escaping from, or the bureaucrats we don't want to run our circles. So that requires the circle keeper to actually do their own assessment and leave their agenda at the door to truly hold space for all the different points of views that are within the circle or within the community. And I know people think that if they have an affinity circle, meaning like-minded or people in common ideological communities or identification communities, that somehow the agendas are all the same. They're not. All of us as human beings have very specific point of views on how to move forward or how to articulate an idea. So I feel like to hold space for other human beings is a profound gift we can give. And I know when somebody's held space for me, I've felt a sense of freedom to actually be at ease with where I am. And so my energy flows more easily. So I really, I think that that is a part of our training and model that is what I'd like to share right now. And with that, I'll pass it to Brian.
Something I'd like to, Shailly, correct me if I'm wrong. What I got from this is that we're supposed to be sharing something that resonates with us about the Circle Keeper Code.
If you want, that's fine. Anything you want to teach people that are listening.
So something that I feel is very important in our work is the part of the Circle Keeper Code where we say we do the work and surrender the results. When you are doing this work, all that you have to do in this work is to create the space for them, to create the space for people to finally be able to speak and finally be able to have a community with each other that has been lacking for a while. That is that is our main goal here. And then whatever happens during the circle, it happens. We don't control anything right there because it's all because all the people. It's just it's in the hands of the community right there. It is what the community wants it to be and what they make it be. And that's part of the reason why it works so well, in my opinion. It's the fact that it gives everyone the option to continue. It gives everyone the option to interpret anything they want. They will interpret any prompt they want to interpret it, or just be able to help even the simple option of just giving them an option to speak or not. It just helps. It just gives people power again, and it gives everyone equal power in the community, which is something that generally is lacking in society now with all the different things going on and just a bunch of disconnect and stuff. So being able to just create a space that allows everyone to be themselves without judgment, without control, it just it leads to a very amazing and authentic experience, which is the best part about it. It's authentic. And with that, I'll pass on to Erica.
So when I sort of think about what sort of a core belief about circles, I can begin to think about something that Alisha talked about, sort of this awareness of realizing in reflection the presence of restorative practices without knowing exactly that restorative practices were present. And so when I think about sort of my conscious circle keeping self and my unconscious circle keeping self, when I became conscious that I was a circle keeper, I suddenly felt very naked. And I don't think I felt that way when I was an unconscious circle keeper and not really realizing what was happening in the circle with the students in my classroom. When I became a school leader, I felt very naked and I was very conscious of being a circle keeper. And the thing that I have held on to is how very, very important it is for me to show up as my authentic, real, and sincere self. And anytime that I was truly who I am, people went on the journey with me. Anytime that I tried to sort of control a situation, it didn't have the same effect. And so this power that the ego has, that it can get in the way of the work, and being able to just be really clear about why are you gathering, why are you creating space, why are you creating a circle? And if it is to control something, then the outcome won't be as productive. And the first time that I was in my school community and created space, did a circle, I wasn't sure, do I put an altar in the middle of the gym or not? What are people gonna say? They don't know me, I'm the new leader. I don't have as big of a personality as my successors, but this is who I am. And I trusted the process. I trusted that if I bring my authentic self, and really was clear about why we're coming together, and we were coming together to recognize who is in our community, who are the people that are in our community, those that are present in the circle and those that were not present. And in that instance, it was acknowledging that I'm not the leader that used to be here, I'm the new leader. And that this is who I am. And as I grew more comfortable with just really being truly authentic and sincere, and recognizing and asking myself, why do I feel that space needs to be created in this moment? And if my agenda seemed to rise to the top, then that was not the reason to have a circle, and I would pull back. And so I would say authenticity, and really, when you're truly authentic, you can, I'm forgetting the exact language that's in the Circle Keeper Code that Shailly just shared, but it's sort of surrendering to the power of the circle. I pass to Maria.
Thank you, Erica. I can't do anything else except echo what you, Erica, said, and also Nicole, you comment in the chat. One of the things that I have really learned in the circle is that I can only meet another to the extent that I have met myself, and the circle process is always kind of gently also pushing me more in that direction. There are a couple of reflections that I also wanted to share in terms of, I've really become curious about the circle work and restorative justice work as energy work, as Shailly mentioned, is one of the Circle Keeper codes, also to be mindful that this is energy work and this is also consciousness work. In the circle, we hold potentially a high energy charge. So what is that about? And I realized that in this work, we really enter a new territory beyond the conventional passive punitive story that's already been echoed in everything that's been shared here. And this is really another consciousness, and to tune into that consciousness, we go in against the deep-seated duality, and we also don't always even have the vocabulary for these things. We are creating the vocabulary as we sit in the circle. And it's the capacity to support it's in the circle, we support one another and increase one another's capacity to face ourselves and to face another. And this is really that opening to bring people together in a new experience of themselves and of the other, and the discomfort that's present, for example, in our bodies as we do this, it tells us that we are alive. So it's really that guidance. And in this, it's so important that we have this artfully, deliberately designed process. During this conversation, we've heard these beautiful stories of surprise, that we sang together and everything that sprouted out of this process. But it's really like having been learning the art and the deliberate structure that's behind, kind of like the garden bed out of which so much can sprout, and so much of it is even an element of surprise. So we must design an artful, deliberate structure to hold everything together. And really then in the circle process, we ground the energy so that participants can be present, fully in the present moment, and, for example, not be whisked away by fear energy, away from the present. But also when we think of, say, anger energy, it's so important to be present with the anger and to engage with the anger of another, because only if I'm interested in your anger can I truly be in relationship with you, as Lama Rod Owens reminds us. And so in this work, we recalibrate in the present and we see the humanity of one another. And then we can talk to one another, for example, what has happened in the past. And the past is not going to hold us back as we look at each other in the eye, in who we are here and now. And if we can do this, we can address the past with some wisdom. And if we can do this, we can also address the future with some wisdom. And this is really the gift of grounding in the circle. And then we can surrender to the process and leave our agendas and outcomes, try to leave it and continue to do that shadow work. And then maybe, yeah, our last point is how our personal work on ourselves and our self-care work, our work on our boundaries, on our anxieties, on our shadows, it's really also the heart of this work. I will pass on to Jennifer.
So I have been working, as they introduced me earlier, on the legislative part of the parole and clemency use of restorative circles. So in my research, I'm starting with 3 basic questions. How is restorative justice being used now? What are the results of that? And what are the recommendations that we have? What I'm finding, just very briefly, the use of restorative justice in legislation across the states in Puerto Rico and Guam is generally like a pretrial diversion kind of thing, or when you're on parole, you're sent to this restorative council. There's a couple of states that have restorative councils set up that, as Shailly had noted earlier, are basically co-opted by the bureaucracy, because it's appointed people. It's, this number of people from the DA's office, this number of people from the public defender's office, these community leaders that are appointed by someone who is one of those bureaucrats. So it's not necessarily a circle the way we do circles, where it's, stakeholders and community leaders. We're looking to heal a whole community rather than just have this person on probation who has to take responsibility for whatever happened. So I'm finding it's also been used to set up funds as a way to find more people in certain states, because you got to contribute to the Restorative Justice Fund when you go on parole. And that's not what our goal is. So the way that's being used is, like, there was one particular case where this juvenile was sent to a restorative justice council as part of his parole program. And when he got there, the head of the council knew his victim and approached him in a very negative way. And this juvenile went to his parole officer and said, I don't feel comfortable in this particular circle or with this council because this is why. And instead of moving him to another program, which was in the community right next to him, they violated his parole and re-adjudicated him. So it's being used. I'm finding evidence like that of what we refer to as co-opting the process. It's not being used to heal, it's being used to beat up people with. You either take responsibility and do it our way, or you're not going to get to do it at all, and you're going to go back into the system. So where I'm hoping that my research will go is a recommendation, because right now we're using it either pre-incarceration to keep people out, supposedly, or after incarceration. I would like to see it used before people go up for parole or clemency, and have these restorative circles. It would obviously start with an affinity circle where the offender and people of his or her family or community would start with that, and then the victims would be invited into the process to have their own affinity circle. And then if both circles are open, then they could come together and hopefully bridge that gap and heal that relationship with the victim or the victim's family, depending on what had happened. This would make it easier for people who are going up for parole or clemency to not have victim opposition, which is one of the biggest hurdles that we see right now, especially for clemency issues in Louisiana, where life is life and you don't have an opportunity for parole, so you have to apply for clemency first. A lot of times people will go up on the board multiple times and they'll have that victim opposition every time. And victim opposition carries huge weight with clemency boards and parole boards. So my hope is that we can figure out a way to legislate processes where we don't allow that bureaucratic co-opting, and we're able to use these processes to bridge those gaps, because there aren't that many ways for people to address their victims. It's kind of like I write a letter and they write a letter if they want to. So but I can never really start that healing process because I'm not allowed to contact them, is the way it goes. So that's my hope eventually. I know I have to start little with the legislation, and Shailly keeps reminding me of that. So anyway, that's what I'm focusing on. So I'm going to pass it on to Deirdre.
I feel like my work is really around, and not only like professionally and with TRC, and it's also personal, to address internal and transgenerational discords. And because that's something that I've committed myself to do, that really just means that really just revolves around shadow keeping and shadow work. And what shadow work is really is just an internal reflection of what's happening for you and what's coming up for you in different situations that could be impacting like who you are in your best self, and being able to interact with others at your best self. And what I've been doing with TRC is like I'm the official, unofficial shadow keeper. So a lot of times, really just holding space for other people. But I also have to recognize for myself that I have to be aware of when things are getting in the way for myself to be able to hold space for others. And it's not just something that I do. It's something in terms of like, I provide this for other people. I have to do it for myself. Because in times when I can't hold space for myself, then I can't effectively be there for another person. And I was thinking a lot about what Maria had said, and the phrase she uses, we belong to one another. And we do. And so when I can't show up for myself, I can't show up for someone else, because it's not going to be healthy. It's not going to be helpful to the next person. And it's not going to be helpful for myself either. So I mean, thinking a lot about, and I'm sure we all can see it now, right? There's a lot of divide in the world that exists right now. And how can we effectively hold space for each other in this space that we're in as a collective, unless we're able to unpack some of the luggage that we have? And the way that I like to refer to shadow keeping is the equivalent of having luggage that you've packed away, or boxes that you've packed away. And some people have more than others. And some people don't want to acknowledge that they have theirs. And some people recognize that it's there. Like, I know mine is over there in the corner. And every week I might look at one box and I might open it and I might touch the top and think about, digging through it and getting rid of some things. But if we don't actually go through our boxes, our luggage, we're just going to be piling on our stuff onto other people's stuff, walking around like bag ladies everywhere, just kind of trudging around a whole bunch of things, and it's not going to be helpful or useful for anyone. And you know those people who like to come and speak to you, and then they throw their luggage onto you, and then you have to find some way to either unpack their luggage or try to give it back, and it's not helpful. And if we were able to do it for ourselves, and to be able to hold space and have that shadow keeping for ourselves, it'd be helpful to teach each other what that could look like. And I think that that resonates for me, because it's not just about doing that within circles, it's also doing that within life. And so if we're saying that we're going to be able to sit together, we have to hold up the mirror to ourselves and be honest and about what is happening for us, and what's coming up for us in different situations, and how we, even with our best intentions, could really bring our agenda to the door and really, you know, shut down communication and building relations with one another. Anthony?
The thesis for me amounts to holding space as a pathway to empowerment and healing. Like that encapsulates the thesis. After circle keeping and holding space for a couple of years now in the different communities that I've mentioned, whether it's with the Latino community, with teams, with large organizations, not-for-profits, with other fellow attorneys, having been invited to lead other circles for other attorneys. That's really the thesis, and it touches on a lot of things that were previously mentioned and are already circulating in the space, but I'll just echo them again, which is that in holding space, for me, it's kind of like gardening. I mentioned gardening a lot, and I have a lot of plants around me, but yeah, like it's like this sunflower to me, like holding space, right? Like there's no doer, there's not Anthony Posada. Like I didn't create the sun for that sunflower to come out, the rain, the wind, the water. But if I put in an intention and I put a seed, then I can easily walk away from it or care for it and make sure that it grows and it becomes the sunflower that it's destined to be. Recognizing that in my own community, all people are brilliant people, are amazing human beings. Have they been given sort of the space? So I think back, like when I wasn't given the space, when I didn't have a space, it felt awful, terrible. So holding space as a pathway to empowerment and healing, because in holding space, we are empowering others. And we acknowledge that it's not the end all be all. Like we can hold the space and it's not like we're cured, but in some form or measure, the ripple of the circle comes back and healing or transformation begins to take place inside of that person. But it is definitely a path that to me speaks volumes in terms of what it can do. And I've seen immediate confirmation and feedback from people who walk into the circles with a very sort of strong attitude of I don't want to engage with this, and then completely being probably the person that wants to speak the most because they have not been given a space like that in the past. And many other examples like that. I can go on, but essentially that's part of the beauty of the gems that I take away from the TRC model of restorative justice, which is also reinforced by how much nature is part of the model. Nature infuses all of the model. It's, if you look at the Circle Keeper Code and things like that, it's the spiral, and the altar has water and light and nature, and it's really important. Again, I think this is Shailly's quote, but I use it all the time, which is whatever it takes to be reminded that we're like rotating on a planet at thousands of miles per hour, but sometimes we forget that small, very basic thing. So it's also important in the holding of space of the letting go. It's a huge exercise of letting go. And so I love that as well, because you get to practice putting that ego aside, which shows up so much, but I'm very thankful for all of that. And so with that, I'll pass it off to Tamara.
So a majority of my focus of work has been bringing the restorative justice circles to Baton Rouge. And one of the first step I would say when bringing a circle to a new area that isn't very, it's a new thing to Baton Rouge, is really, a lot of people touched on it, was shadow keeping, checking your agenda at the door, letting the circle do what the circle is intended, not having that hold that control over how you want the circle to go. For me, I'll say it was natural for me to want, you know, because I've experienced the circle, I see how great it is, I see, you know, the great results that can come from it, and I want that so badly when I bring it to other communities. And I really had to remind myself that, you know, yes, I want this circle to be as great as it is, and in order for that to be, I have to let it go. I have to allow the circle to work and allow the people within that circle to give what they want to give. And I would say that was probably the biggest step for me when thinking about bringing restorative justice practices to Baton Rouge. And so moving forward, once I've had a few conversations with talking with Shailly and some of my co-facilitators with shadow keeping, working past that, I guess, control hold that I would say I sometimes have, moving into looking at the different groups and hearing what it is that they want. Because I think it's very easy to look at a community and say, oh, you know, maybe they're hurting in this area and I want to alleviate that. But reaching out to that community and asking them, what are your concerns? What are things that you want to change? What is something that's bothering you within your community? And hearing those and saying, okay, that's where I think the circle might benefit, and allow that concern to show in the circle. And so I think once I, one, got over my shadows, two, hearing what the community wants, being able to then, I guess, explain the circle a little bit easier, because it's not easy to tell people, hey, come sit down in this circle, we're going to talk about all our problems. I know a lot of people would probably kind of say, oh, you know, I don't know, because you don't know the people in your circle, you're not connected. But that's where the circle process takes place, is like a lot of people touched on earlier, creating that space and letting people know that this circle is meant for you. It's a safe space. You can share yourself. You can be vulnerable. That was, I would say, a keyword that I learned in my circle process and training, was knowing that it's okay to be vulnerable, and being vulnerable is a big part of the process, and allowing for the change that you want to see to occur. So, you know, as a circle keeper, that's something that I think you do have to be mindful of, is allowing, one, for yourself to be vulnerable so people can understand that there's not a power dynamic in this circle. It's not the circle keeper is here and everybody in this circle is just a participant, but that everybody is on a level playing field, and everybody can add to the circle to essentially let the process flow. And I would say those were main steps when I think about the work that I've done and the process that it takes to bring the circle to new areas. And I would say, moving forward, not only leaving the process in the circle, but once it's kind of closed and ended, moving forward as to what you're going to do with that information and that change. You know, I'd say it's a kind of a two-part thing. It's one, having the circle and everybody talking about their concerns and voicing their problems, but then two, remembering that we can take what was shared in this circle and apply it to our outside world and move forward with it. And those were, I would say, my main takeaways, my focus for the work that I've been doing in Baton Rouge. And I'll pass it on to Nirmala. Nirmala.
Thank you, Tamara.
I'll get it.
So I would say that my my main takeaway, and just the work that I've really been steeped in the last few years around playback theater and storytelling, is that they're incredibly powerful models for restorative justice. Because as I've moved through them, I've seen how they're incredible vehicles for understanding, for catharsis, for social change, and for finding liberation from a lot of the really oppressive stories that weigh us down. So there's a 6-step process that I've identified that I think can be common to restorative justice circles and also to playback theater and community participatory theater. So the first step is it's just intention setting. And that intention can be as simple as saying, we are in this space together to see what stories want to emerge, or it could be even more specific. We're here to explore grief. We're here to explore connection. And just that simple act of setting that intention, I think, creates a container for the whole process. And it creates structure. And within that structure, there's a lot of freedom for exploration and for just emergent stories to come through. And then the second step is what, this is actually really common in playback theater. It's just identifying social context. It's being mindful of who is in the room. What is it that they might be bringing? So sometimes this requires a little prep work in advance, but there's ways to do this in theater right on the spot, just in terms of identifying who's in the room and doing it in a way that's very playful and inclusive, that's creating safe space for people to show up in their full selves. And this actually includes people who are, let's just say, actors in a playback theater troupe, or circle keepers in a restorative process. It's knowing that they are also a part of this social context, and they are participants. They're not just holding the space, but they're participants, which can be kind of a complex line to toe, right? But that's something that I think is really important. And then after that, the third step is just the ritual. And you can call that the ritual of the playback theater process or the ritual of the circle. And that also includes the prompts that we offer. And this is just an act of creating this sense of shared meaning and shared space. And then after that, the next step is what I think of as deep listening, which a lot of people have actually spoken about, maybe not necessarily using those words, but it's a huge part of holding space, right? And it's creating space that I like to think of the space as being both safe and brave, because I mean, I think most of us know that safe space, it's a noble intention, but it's actually not really realistic. And for a lot of the communities that I've been a part of, there is not really a safe space, but we're getting to as much safety as we possibly can. And we're also creating space for courage, acts of courage. And there's the listening that comes from listening to others, but also to ourselves, listening to what is said and what is not said, who is speaking and who is not speaking, listening to the silences in between. And also, and I think Maria spoke to this as far as talking about energy, listening to our bodies, what's coming up for us as we speak or as other people speak. What are the places of discomfort that we can actually kind of deepen into and welcome? And then the next step is what I think of as integration. And this is something that I think, this is something I've definitely experienced in the playback theater process, where at the end of the process, there's an act of using the language of the group, distilling some of the stories and creating like the thread that is connecting all those stories with one another. So it's almost an act of capturing like the ocean of stories that is being held in this single space, and it's offering some kind of a coherent narrative. So it's not the same as offering a solution, but it can be really profound, even just to mirror the words that came up in the stories that people shared. And then the final step, as I see it, is the act of planting seeds for a new story. And obviously this isn't something that's just going to happen in one performance or in one circle. It's continuous. But I am a strong believer that the solutions and the possibilities that we're looking for are not things that we need to seek from outside sources. They're actually present in the wisdom, the collective wisdom of the people who are gathered and the stories that they've shared, and they will come up. And I think that a huge part of planting new seeds is recognizing that the stories that we're so often caught in, and these are the stories of, you know, the punitive system of justice that we live in. I would say it's also the story of, you know, the hero's journey, which tends to focus on one specific person battling against the odds. And I actually think of that as being a very toxic story in many ways. And really kind of, you know, perpetuating like the cult of personality and single people doing big things. And really, I mean, all of our voices and all of our efforts are needed, and community is needed in these new stories that I think are going to emerge, that are going to lead us into new ways of thinking about justice. So I think that we can learn as people who are storytellers, and every single one of us is a storyteller. We can learn to be with the emerging stories that want to be told. And that's a very, as I'm talking about this, I realize it might sound abstract, but it's a very mystical process. And I personally think of it as being a really spiritual process. This process of gathering in community to see what stories are present and what stories want to emerge through us. And I think that this isn't something that you can do in advance. You can't make it up. It's something that has to come through you and come through your spirit and your body. And I think that when we're engaged with this is how we start to tell new stories that really are life affirming and inclusive, radically inclusive. And I think this is the beginning of creating new models of justice and healing in our worlds. I will pass it to Alisha.
So kind of like what stands out for me is that when, I don't know, like, so there's no such thing as professionalism. And I say that because like, I used to have to think like I had to be everybody better in the room. I had to make up for my incarceration. I had to just move forward and always prove myself. And then kind of like right after like the restorative circle training that I've attended, I've realized that I had like two really big events that were coming up that I was essentially facilitating. And usually I would go into these spaces and I would go into a space of understanding that, oh, I have to be best, I have to be professional, everything has to be on point. But then I remember the things that I would learn at the restorative training, and that is to bring my whole self, right? And to just always be authentic, no matter where I go. I'm Alisha, no matter what space I'm in. It doesn't matter if I'm with friends or I'm in my job or I'm just being in the community. And so I really take that to heart because it's something, this restorative process has kind of opened up my eyes to understand of what I want to do with this, right? And it's honestly, it's probably a little bit selfish of me. So since my almost 3.5 years of being released, I've understood that there is no place for healing for trans folks who are sex workers. Still is. And I saw that, right? And I saw that how I would always have to move into spaces and I would have to prove my womanhood into coming into these spaces. And then it becomes more about, I'm now teaching you what it means to be transgender and my experience is validated. And so there was nothing to heal that trauma. There was nothing to heal the trauma when it comes into being incarcerated. There's nothing when it comes to dealing with trauma. I mean, I was a child, I was a sex worker. In prison, I was a sex worker. When I got out of prison, I had to do sex work until I got my feet on the ground. And there's nothing for that. And it takes something part of you. And the trauma that I've experienced, knowingly, unknowingly that I've experienced in being a sex work, it's realized that understands that I need a place to heal, right? Because I can't move into a space to understand like my shadow work, right? I can't move into a space of really understanding who I am in this world without dealing with trauma, who I am in an intimate relationship and the problems that I have there, right? The problems that I have, that we understand that moving into a space for just a space of healing. And that's what I want to move forward with this work, because in order to bring my authentic self, I have to heal, right? And I have to heal. And I know so many of my trans sisters who need to heal as well. And that's what it comes down to, is bringing your authentic selves, and no matter what space you bring into, and always in a constantly state of healing. And yeah, and that's one of this, circle keeper codes is like, it's that authentic self and this understanding that we need to come together and we need to just be you, no agenda at the door. No, there can be affinity circles like where I want to take this work, but it's understanding like, no, everyone doesn't have to like the circle process. Everyone's not going to heal, and there's people in my personal life, right, that I probably will never forgive, right? And that I will hold that, right? And I will hold that, and I will move forward with my life. But I can continue doing the work, so I find a place of serenity and peace, and where it connects, because the only option I do have is to show up for myself. And tying it, with this, one thing I like about this restorative process is, I think Anthony, you said it was, everything is tied in nature, and I really thought that was amazing, right? Every day the sun shows up, every night the moon shows up. We know when it's fall, we know when it's winter, we know when it's summer, right? It shows up, right? Climate change, no climate change, like it shows up all the time. So if nature that has been around way longer than I was even thought of, if they can show up consistently and be their authentic selves, why can't I, when I'm a speck in the timeline of what this, this earth looks like. Yeah, and then with that, I want to pass it off to Barry.
Well, Alisha, you hit a lot of what I was going to say. I thought Erica, too, as an educator, bringing it to the South Bronx. I think Tamara, you said it too, is like, if you're not going to be transparent and authentic and vulnerable, at least from a student standpoint, the kids smell it. So if you're not real, you can do whatever you want. Nothing's going to change. It could look beautiful, but there's nothing that's going to change. I mean, that's at least my experience is that the transformation happens because there is no agenda. That, like Shailly talking about nature, that it flows. And as an educator, we're so used to programs, but this is people, so it's a process, and it's hard for us to give up control because we're indoctrinated to have control. So it's, using this restorative approach it's so transformational, because you get more done by letting go of control, but you have to be willing to be vulnerable and transparent. And if you're not, I mean, it's just like going to Alcoholics Anonymous. If you don't want change won't happen. You have to start wanting change, and that to me is the essence of being the circle keeper. Is you, at least in education, you mirror whatever you do. You're like a mirror. So if you're willing to be vulnerable and check your agenda at the door and share what's underneath the iceberg, kids smell it. It might not happen the first circle, it might not happen the second, but once they see, oh wow, this is a really safe place, because there's a lot of distrust because they're brought up that way. That it just flows and it becomes unbelievably transformational. But that's the hardest part, is at least in the education part, is letting go of the control and realizing that this is a process, and that it can be ugly. Sometimes it looks like, when it looks out of control, it's actually when the most healing is happening. And it's like a noisy classroom. Things are actually really going well. It just doesn't look the way we want it to look, because people are really speaking from the heart.
Thank you. My computer crashed. I had to reboot, but here we are. We're all back. It's so exciting to do Zoom. One thing I don't know if anybody really got to deeply dive into, and I know we have 10 minutes left. But when Erica was talking about what I call a centerpiece, that we create a center, we usually take a round tablecloth and put each of the elements, represent each one of the elements in the centerpiece. So meaning a bowl of water, a fire, a flame, an image of a fire if you can't really light a flame, a live flower, rocks, because rocks really are beautiful in a centerpiece, and something alive, plant, a flower. And what we found, and I know, Barry, the first time we ran a circle at your school, the kids, they walked in, they're like, oh my gosh, this is like, it's just surprising to see nature in institutions. And I think that's what Erica was referring to when she first became principal. I know, I mean, she's told me this before, but when she first became principal, she actually created the centerpiece to have a circle before the community ever met her, which can feel intimidating, but I just want to say that we have to reclaim Mother Nature too. We can't just say Mother Nature is only for religious activities. No, Mother Nature is our mother. We have to connect to the elements, I believe, to reconnect to ourselves. So I just wanted to complete that thought because I felt a little bit incomplete in the conversation. And so we will have time for question and answer after the second session. Charles would moderate the question and answer, and whichever one of the panelists can come back at 4, we would really be grateful. I know there are a lot of educators from around the country that really want to understand how to do restorative justice in their schools. There are a lot of community members, a lot of activists. I mean, people want answers, and I'm not sorry. I was told not to say sorry. I wish we had more time is what I'm trying to say. So I just want to close this circle out and sort of ask everybody if you could just say what's anchoring you in these times. And I will say my answer till the end, if I could. So Brian?
Family, friends, and also just having a clear idea of what I want to do in the near future anchors me during these times. And I'll pass on to Erica.
Nature, in particular plants, because I can smell them. Their colors are beautiful. I can hear the trees shaking. I can taste it and I can feel it. And in particular, there's something about rubbing a sage leaf that just, anytime I see sage, I love rubbing those leaves. It's the breathing and it's so grounding. I pass to Maria.
Erica, I feel that fragrance. I feel called to share as an anchoring. On my altar here during this panel discussion, I've had this tiny origami crane that has been folded out of a book cover. This comes from a friend who is incarcerated on death row since 20 years for a crime he committed at the age of 19 as a Black teen. And I just want to share his words as an anchoring for these times. I try to make use of discarded or ignored bits in my art because we all have something worthwhile for another. We just have to find it. And it took me coming to death row to find my worth as a human and as a citizen of the world. I have committed some grave acts in my life and I will never be able to undo them. Yet the very least I can do is to improve myself. It is my hope that someone else will also take control of their narrative and tell themselves a new tale, a grander story of themselves for all of our benefit. I pass on to Jennifer.
So as a prison wife and a mother of grown boys, I think that my grounding comes from hope. I have to have hope that things will change and can change. I have to have hope that the next generation is going to do better than what we've done. And Brian and his cohorts give me hope in that, just to make that note. So because you can't give up hope no matter what. Things change every day. People make changes every day, and that's how the world continues to grow and be better. So I will pass on to Deirdre.
I've been thinking a lot about this question, and the more that I think about it, the more I realize that what I'm holding on to in these times is really just my community. And it's not my community that I'm in relations with in this very moment, in the space that I could say, that's one person, that's another person, but it's just everyone here I feel like is my community, because whether I physically met you or not, there are people who are very like-minded or who desperately are looking for some sort of solution to the discourse that happened within our world, our country. And that's what's holding me and anchoring me. Anthony?
Yoga keeps me grounded. Yoga for me is union with the divine, and as a Sivananda yoga instructor and now recent activity here with the community, it's how I can keep doing what I do. So that's it for me. It encapsulates family and love and devotion and action and service. I pass it on to Tamara.
Well, I guess I'd say I'm a bit of an optimist, so I always think, there are better days coming. So kind of similar to Jen, hope. I know, 40 days, 40 nights it rained, but I know on that 41st day, I'm going to be happy and to see the sunlight. So just the knowledge that better days are there, they're coming. I may be in day 23, but I know that 41st day, it's going to be there, it's going to come. And I'll pass it on to Nirmala.
So I resonate with everything everyone has shared. So I can just add my +1 to everything else. But one of the things that's been an anchor for me is that I have been sober for the past 8 months. And I think for anyone who enters that journey of sobriety, you understand how it becomes a lifestyle. And it's not just about denying yourself of your old vices, but for me, it's been this process of just continuing to let the parts of myself that were offline for such a long time without me even knowing it, to let them come back online in a way, and to be even more present to beauty and grief and pain and loss and wonder. And it inspires me to keep showing up, and it inspires me to keep expanding, even just like my definition of who I am and what I'm capable of. And yeah, that's been a really important anchor for me. And I'll pass it to Alisha.
Something that keeps me anchored during these times is honestly my chosen family, my community, like my friends. Like, they are like my inspiration. They keep me going. Everything from organizing with them or everything when I feel like, we just want to eat like crappy pizza and just relax on their porch. And my one particular friend has a cat and like 3 cats, and the one cat who likes nobody else likes me. So I feel really special. I'm trying to convince my roommates because I need a cat now. I love that cat. And yeah, so what anchors me is my community and cats. And with that, I'll pass to Barry.
Is Barry not around? Barry, did we lose you? Okay, I'm going to assume that he had some issues. I had some issues. I don't know, we're in the same region upstate. Maybe something's going on. So I have a way that I like to close us out for this roundtable. What anchors me is there are many things that anchor me, but what's been anchoring me this week is music. And I have been listening to the song I found on Apple, and unfortunately it's in a compilation. I could not get the singer's name. I tried really hard all week. It's in a compilation called Gospel Music Band that was put together in 2011. But I'm going to see if it comes through this format. It should, right? Let's try. But we're going to close out this roundtable with a song. And of course, you're welcome to sing along. I'm not going to force everybody like I usually do. And when we resume, we are going to be lucky enough to have a 5-minute movement session with Malika, just to get us all moving a little bit before roundtable 2. So, and then thank you all panelists. I mean, it goes without saying that it's just like truly a joy to be with you all in this format or any format. And I can't wait to finally be able to hug everybody soon.